The Nordic population is growing, and 2/3 of the growth is based on immigration. What are the causes and effects of growing minorities in small towns? What is the capacity of medium-sized Nordic cities to overcome barriers and connect segregated districts and people through urban development projects and planning? How does the famous Danish Ghetto policy work in practice, and what are its lasting effects? Welcome to the second session of Nordregio Forum 2020, Planning and Policies for Inclusive Towns and Cities.
Welcome, dear audience. You're a fabulous mix of exciting people, experiences, and countries. We hope to provide you with some new insights and learnings today, but we of course also want to hear from you. So my name is Åsa Ström Hildestrand, and I'm Head of Communications at Nordregio, and here to guide you through the day, together with my dear colleague.
Thank you, Pipsa Salami from Nordregio. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So the topic of today is inclusive towns and cities. This is a major challenge in all the Nordic countries today, and specifically when we're targeting the Sustainable Development Goals and the Nordic Vision 2030. So the main question for today is really, how do we create communities where everyone can meet, contribute and thrive regardless of background? This session of Nordregio Forum is co-hosted by the Nordic Welfare Center and the Nordic Integration Program. So our first guest speaker today is Kristin Marklund. You're the project manager for this program, and we're very happy to have you on board today. And please tell us a little bit more what happens within the Nordic collaboration on integration.
Thank you, Åsa. Yes, I'm going to tell you about this project, Nordic Cooperation on Integration. And this is a project that started in the end of 2016, initiated by the Nordic Council of Ministers. And the purpose of the project is to facilitate a cooperation between the Nordic countries on the integration of refugees and immigrants. And all the project results including compiled research, best practice, and so on, can be seen at the website integrationnorden.org. Today, Nordic is launching the report Overcoming Barriers to Social Inclusion, and in the Nordic cities through policy and planning, and we have compiled the research into a short version which was published, I think, yesterday. So it's really new. So why is cooperation between the Nordic countries so important? In the project, we have many comparisons between the countries across different topics. And I'm going to give you a few examples. We have compiled research from the Nordic settlement policies in a short version of a report, and where you can compare the integration programs between the countries and how it affects different groups. And you can find this report on our website. Another example of Nordic cooperation is a meeting we had in September with ministers and government agencies regarding unaccompanied refugee minors. At the meeting, we talked about certain challenges, for example, the situation of unaccompanied girls, what's happened when they turn 18, and mental health and well-being questions. And the result of the meeting is a summarized report that will be published soon. I also want to highlight that we have a conference on the 3rd of December, a digital conference, of course, in cooperation with the Nordic Cage project, Coming of Age in Exile. And the CAGE project includes several reports on young refugees in the Nordics regarding public health, education, and participation in the labor market. So it's possible to sign up for the conference at our website. Next year, a new topic will be COVID-19 and its impact on immigrants. The first report will focus on labor market inclusion, and we are going to make comparisons between countries on how COVID-19 affects different age groups, women, men, and young people, and so on. Another report is going to we have another report in cooperation with Nordregio, and that report will focus on who is left behind during Corona times. Factors that have emerged as reasons behind the overrepresentation of people infected by COVID-19 in some special neighborhoods. So that was some examples from the project, and I hope you will find this interesting and that you can spend a few minutes maybe reading at the website integrationnorden.org. Thank you.
So much, Christine. And again, just visit the website for all the information you need and also about the different networks and projects that you've been working on. So, Pipsa, it's also time to introduce our Menti questions for today.
Yes, like also mentioned, we will be using Menti today, which probably most of you are already familiar with. It's an interactive tool online. So now I would like you to open a new tab on your browser and go to menti.com, or use your phone browser and use the same address, and then type in the code that you see on the screen now. And soon we will launch our first Menti question. So the first question, we would like to get to know our audience a little bit better, and also for you to get an understanding of who we have here with us. So we would like to know what are you working with when we talk about these topics? Are you perhaps working with planning of inclusive neighborhoods, national policy making, local projects on integration, or research and analysis? And before we get to the results, also I would like to talk more about the program today.
Yes, well, you have some more time to think of who you are, really. No, but honestly, we are starting out today with a dive into recent migration trends with our colleague Timothy Heleniak. And then we'll compare policies and projects for social inclusion, urban development, and youth involvement across the Nordic countries. Finally, we'll also get to know 2 Nordic networks of cities working proactively for inclusion. So in short, we'll have 3 keynote speakers, or 3 keynotes. We will have a Q&A session with our keynotes, where you can, of course, ask your questions. So the other tip of the day, besides working with Menti, is to find the Vimeo chat window hopefully just beside your video window, and put your questions and comments right there. So after the Q&A, we'll have a short leg stretch, about 5 minutes, and then we'll do a Nordic tour and visit some regional and local examples of inclusion in practice. And finally, at 3:30, we'll start an informal Zoom meet and greet, where you can continue and mingle with our speakers, ask those questions that weren't answered during the Q&A session, etc. So stay tuned for that, and we really hope to make this as engaging as possible, despite these crazy COVID times and the fact that we have to be digital all the time. Just join the chat conversation, put in your examples, links, everything that you have, because we know we have a very knowledgeable audience today. And again, we wish you hopefully a wonderful session to come. What about our Menti results, Pipsa?
Yes, could we see the Menti results, please? Here we have them. So we can see that a lot of our audience is on research and analysis, but we also have a nice distribution of different kinds of people working with different issues. So I think it's going to be a very interesting session.
Yes, and again, just hope you find the chat function in Vimeo. So just start asking your questions as you've listened to our first keynote speaker. I would like to welcome Timothy Heleniak. He's a senior research fellow at Nordregio and also cartographer. So he will guide us through a number of our signature maps on demographic change, migration patterns, and growing minorities in small towns. Tim, are you with us?
What's that?
Good to see you.
Yes. Okay, there we go. Yes, thank you very much, Åsa, and to the other speakers. The title of my talk is Migration Mobility, Growing Minorities in Small Towns. And I guess my mandate is to give a broad overview, and the subsequent speakers will provide a little bit more granularity on these issues of migration and integration. Next slide, please. So I start off with this quote from a recent issue of the State of Nordic Region on migration and integration. Managing migration is one of the most complex challenges for politicians and societies in our times. The Nordic countries are no longer the homogeneous small societies that they used to be, and as I'll show here, there's more and more migrants, the societies are becoming much more diverse. Next slide, please. And I start with a couple of slides showing trends in another country that has had a much longer history of migration than the Nordic countries, that is the United States. And you can see on the chart, the yellow bar shows the percent of the foreign-born population in the United States over the last 150 or so years. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the foreign-born population in the United States was about 15%. And this was during the big wave of migration from Europe to the United States, including large numbers of people migrating from the Nordic countries. With some subsequent restrictions on migration, the percent foreign-born declined to about 4% in 1970, but has recently increased dramatically and is back up to almost the levels it was in the early 1900s. Next, please. And the subject of what we're talking about is minorities in small towns, small municipalities. And I show this map for the United States, which shows the percent, the increase in the foreign-born populations by county for the 3,000 or so counties over the last 30 years in the United States. And you can see here places in the South, the Midwest, have had rather large increases, almost a doubling of foreign-born people over this last decade. And this has caused issues for, you're starting to see foreign-born children in schools, non-native English speakers, et cetera. So it's a challenge for the counties, certainly in the United States. Next, please. So going back to the Nordic countries, this shows the percent foreign-born in the United States over the last, in the Nordic countries over the last 30 years. And the foreign-born shares have increased to historically high levels most recently. And as the opening slide showed, about 2/3 of the population increases come from migration, not from people having more births than there are deaths. And there is certainly an issue with aging. I mean, the Nordic countries are aging rather rapidly. So migration, it is possible for migration to slow this down, but not to totally solve the issue. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to show three different slides here, three different points in time. As as migration has increased in the Nordic countries, there's been a growing diversity of countries of origin into the Nordic countries. And this shows the 1990s, most of the migration, the big ascending countries to any Nordic country was another Nordic country. So a lot of most of the migration was actually intra-Nordic migration, a few people coming from Germany and other places. Next slide, please. But if you go forward to the 2000s, you're starting to see two trends emerge. First of all, Poland, some of the other EU accession countries started to send large numbers of migrants to the the Nordic countries. You can see down in the bottom, Iraq, a refugee sending country, has also become a major country of origin for the Nordic countries. Next slide, please. And here, more recently in the 2010s, you're starting to see a lot of what we call the refugee sending countries, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, are sending large numbers of people to the Nordic countries. So you're seeing this kind of growing diversity of sending countries. Next slide, please. And here I show 3 different maps for 1995, 2005, and 2015, showing the percent foreign-born by municipality in the Nordic countries. So you see, along with the large increases in foreign-born populations at the national level, you're also seeing large foreign-born populations in almost every municipality across the Nordic countries. Next slide, please. So, yeah, like I said, there's a large increase in almost every municipality except for a few in Finland. And if you think back to the map of the United States and the growing foreign-born populations in the counties, the pattern in the Nordic countries kind of mirrors that, where no longer are people just going to the capital regions, but there's a growing diversity of receiving regions. Next slide, please. And this rather colorful but complex map shows the largest minority group in each municipality in the Nordic region. This is from the most recent State of the Nordic region. And I'll explain this a little bit. So far, the largest group in every single Nordic municipality are the native-born population. So in every municipality in Finland, Finns are the majority population. There are not yet any majority municipalities where the sum of all the different minority groups exceeds that of the majority population. This is based on place of birth. So a couple patterns emerge here. And this is a combination of both historical migrations, but some more recent migrations. If you look at Finland, the regions in green are people born in Sweden. If you look at Sweden, the regions in blue in northern Sweden are people born in Finland. But if you look at Finland, in eastern Finland, those regions in blue are those people born in the former Soviet Union, either Russia or the Baltics usually. In southern Sweden, those regions shown in different shades of red are actually those people from some of these refugee-sending countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, and others. Those in yellow in Norway and in Iceland are those people from the EU accession countries. Most of these are from Poland or the Baltic states. Next slide, please. In the previous cooperation program, we did a series of case studies in rural areas looking at the issue of immigration. What was the labor market niche that people occupied? How did some of these small rural municipalities which hadn't had a lot of migrants, how did they accommodate some of these people? So we did these across 6 different regions in the Nordic countries. Next, please. One of the places we did a case study was Punkalaiden, which is a town in southern Finland, small town of about 800 people. Receives both labor migrants, and this is the picture in the middle is a fellow from Myanmar working in a coffin-making factory, which is rather common. I'm thinking of this as this is the finished forest. It was also a place that had a refugee resettlement center, which would open and close periodically over time, depending on demand. And this is a Syrian family that we met who had been resettled there in 2016. Next slide, please. And we also looked at Jämtland in northern Sweden. And one of the things we found in all of these case studies was this person, she's an integration coordinator. Because a lot of these refugees come without social networks, without professional networks, there was always a person who would kind of substitute for that, who would link them up with the labor market and sometimes other social contexts. Next, please. Another place we looked at was Ísafjörður in northwest Iceland. Next, please. One of the points that really came out here was that immigrants are a very important part of the workforce. A lot of the industries wouldn't be able to work without immigrants. And there were so many Polish immigrants that there's actually a Polish grocery store, and Polish was actually the language in some of the different workplaces there. And migrants were coming both high-skilled and low-skilled occupations. Next, please. And this is another place we looked at was Bodø and Herøy in northern Norway, similar to Ísafjörður, migrants working in fishing, fish processing. There was a refugee resettlement center there as well. Next slide, please. In my last slide, I show the cover of a recently updated book called The Diversity Explosion, looking at this issue of diversity in the United States. And a similar book or study could be certainly done of the Nordic countries, but some conclusions. Migration into the Nordic countries is likely to continue, probably not at the levels we saw in 2015, 2016. And of course, the big wild card is the pandemic and the subsequent shutdown, and that will likely slow down migration. The Nordic countries have well-established integration programs, but migration remains a challenge. And the key conclusion from that study is that there's no single policy that works to help integrate immigrants. You need a combination of different policies. So, thank you.
So much, Tim. That was a very important update, I think, or giving us an overview of migration trends and how the Nordic countries are actually very rapidly becoming new. They have a new face now. We're all becoming much more diverse, and the world is coming to the Nordic countries in an unprecedented way. Let's go over to a Menti question.
Yes, I hope you have now succeeded to type in the code and you're in Menti. We would like to quiz you on Tim's presentation. Since Tim is from the US, we have a US-related question. In Sweden, 19% of the population is foreign-born. How does that percentage compare to the US? Is it less than in the US, about the same as the US, or higher than the US? And this was actually in Tim's presentation, so we just wanted to make sure if you were awake or not. So while we wait for the results, Åsa, you had a question?
I do have a question for you, Tim. You mentioned early in your presentation that one of the other major trends in the Nordic countries, as elsewhere in Europe and Western countries, is the aging population. So could you just develop this a little bit further? Do you see that specifically in these smaller municipalities that with the influx of migrants that actually the old age dependence ratio could be a little bit better balanced with the influx of younger migrants? How does it look?
Yes, thank you for the question. My colleague and I did a study a couple of years ago looking at the impact of migration on population decline, population aging. And what we found at the national levels was that the number of migrants that you would have to have into the Nordic countries would be politically and probably logistically impossible. I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of people. But certainly, because the migrants tend to be in the working ages and oftentimes in young working ages, 20s and 30s, they can certainly help increase the size of the labor force, both at the national levels and certainly in some of these smaller, more remote municipalities across the Nordic region. And this is what we're seeing. This is what we're seeing in the numbers and also in terms of the case studies that we did. So migration can't solve the whole aging problem, but can certainly help alleviate it, especially in some of these smaller municipalities.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I think that sounds quite hopeful, and I guess the challenge is for these smaller municipalities to actually make it worthwhile for the migrants to stay there and integrate them in the local labor market. Thank you, Pipsa. Menti results.
Can we see the Menti results now? Oh, Yeah, the correct answer that it's actually higher in Sweden than it is in the US, which might be surprising when thinking about the history of the US, but it's actually about 13% of the population that is foreign-born in the US. So there we go.
All right. So again, the Nordic countries are becoming more diverse than the US. Well, it all depends how you count, of course. In the US, most people have some kind of foreign background, however you would define that. Anyway, thank you for contributing to and answering our Menti questions. And don't forget to also put any additional questions or comments to Tim and our following speakers in the chat. So now it's actually time for our second keynote. And this time we've asked Mats Stjernberg, who's a senior research fellow at Nordregio, and Sandra Oliveira Acosta, who's research fellow at Nordregio, to present their very fresh report, which is also very much related to the title of this event today, Overcoming Barriers to Social Inclusion in Nordic Cities. So Mats, I think you're about to start, right? Share some of your findings of this case study report where you've been around to all the Nordic countries and looked at policies and planning for inclusion. Are you with us, Mats?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much for the introduction, Åsa. And good afternoon to everyone. So my name is Mats Stjernberg. I'm a senior research fellow at Nordregio, and we will now, with my colleague Sandra, present some of the key findings of our study, Overcoming Barriers to Social Inclusion in the Nordic Cities. And actually, as Christine already mentioned in the introductory talk, the executive summary of this report was published yesterday. So this is a very recent report, you could say. But if we go to the next slide, please, here we can just briefly start off by outlining that really the key question that we have addressed in this study is how do Nordic governments and municipalities seek to overcome barriers to social inclusion, and at the same time also counteracting inequality and segregation through means of urban policy and urban planning. And we have conducted 5 different case studies, each focusing on the 5 Nordic countries. And you could say that these 5 different cases, they focus on 2 key topics or themes. And the first of these is urban regeneration. So we have looked at area-based regeneration projects that target certain specific neighborhoods that are dealing with different types of challenges and problems. And then the second topic could be outlined as integration of different types of immigrant groups and their descendants. But by no means should these 2 themes be viewed in isolation from each other. And we see that in many of the examples that we have studied that these 2 themes are quite closely related, and also elements of both of these are often present in a lot of the projects that we have looked at. But if we go to the next slide, then I would just briefly like to start off by briefly just mentioning each of the 5 cases, briefly explaining what they are about, and then we will have a more in-depth look at 2 of these cases. So the Finnish case examines the city of Pori in Western Finland, looking at regeneration projects in post-war housing estates, and really looking at how these types of projects and initiatives have evolved in a long-term perspective over time. If we look at the next slide, please, then we see that the Norwegian case is thematically closely linked to the Finnish case, but here we have looked at the city of Drammen and specifically on how the municipality plans for social inclusion in the neighborhood of Fjell. And the next slide, please, shows the Danish case, which we will hear more about actually after our presentation, namely focusing on the so-called ghetto policies that have emerged as a key policy strategy in Denmark during the 2000s as a way of dealing with segregation. And the next slide shows the Icelandic case, which we will also hear more about later on in the program, specifically about the municipality of Reykjanesbaer and how the municipality deals with integration of labor migrants, but also looking at how a former military base is being converted into a regular common neighborhood. And then finally, on the next slide, we see the Swedish case, which Sandra will present to you in a while, more in depth. And this case looks at housing for newly arrived refugees and what types of planning challenges, critical local reactions or resistance is brought about for municipalities. So on the next slide, we would just like to show that we will now have a closer look at the Finnish and the Swedish case, and then we will then end this with a concluding discussion, and then we can, of course, in the Q&A, maybe you might have questions related to these other ones as well that we can try to address. But if we go to the next slide, I would like to just briefly outline the Finnish case. We have looked at area-based regeneration in post-war housing estates. And in Finland, when we're talking about overcoming segregation and inclusion, it's very much about really addressing these specific neighborhoods that were built in the 60s and in the 70s. So these types of areas have long been prominent on the Finnish urban policy agenda. And over the years, they have increasingly become perceived as areas of decline. And especially in the city of Pori, there is a very long tradition of these types of regeneration projects, you could say ranging back to the early 1980s. So in this case study, we have looked at how these policies have evolved over time, from the early 80s basically to the current day, you could say. And if we look at the next slide, I would like to highlight some of the key aspects of this case study. So we looked at 9 different projects that were carried out over the decades, and really looking at how the aims and objectives of the projects have evolved and how the implementation and the measures that have been carried out has varied in different times. But we see here that there is a clear, you could say, path dependency where the project aims have not changed that radically over time. And actually, many of the successive projects, they have sort of continued the aims and the measures that have been carried out in previous ones. So there is kind of a long-term planning perspective here in many cases, you could say. And of course, numerous measures have been carried out in parallel, so it has not been about dealing with one certain specific issue, but rather measures concerning upgrading the built environment, for example, and the housing stock, but also ones that are related to strengthening social participation, as well as dealing with structural challenges such as unemployment and also enhancing well-being, to name a few of the key ones. And if you go to the next slide, please, I would just like to emphasize some of the success factors that we see. So in this long history of these types of projects, we see that several successive projects where the next project has sort of continued the efforts from the previous one, has in many ways contributed to a more favorable development of the areas. And for example, within the municipal organization, this has stimulated dialogue over sectoral boundaries. So maybe this has over time led to gradually adopting a more holistic approach to these questions. Another aspect is that as there has been many projects and often in the very same specific neighborhoods, this is something that has accustomed the inhabitants in these areas to these types of projects, which in turn has enhanced participation in many cases. But we also see like one of the perhaps most tangible aims or success factors that we really see is that the refurbishment of the housing stock and outdoor spaces is something that over the decades has improved the quality and made the appearance of the neighborhoods more attractive. So something that seems to have contributed to greater housing satisfaction among the residents in these areas. And specifically here, something that was mentioned in our case study interviews was that like refurbishments in the social rented housing stock, that is something that has clearly been one of the key issues here, and this has been made possible by state funding. But if we go to the next slide, please, I would just also like to mention here, I mean, when we're talking about area-based regeneration initiatives, it is evident that especially when we're dealing with more broader structural problems or problems where the structural causes are located outside of the immediate neighborhood, then it becomes more difficult. For example, unemployment has been high ever since the deep economic recession in the early 1990s in a lot of these neighborhoods. So as we see here on the slide showing the change in unemployment rate between 1990, 2010, and so forth, and we see that unemployment, which increased rapidly in the 1990s, has remained at very high levels ever since. And we could also mention that, for example, from the perspective of ensuring longevity, even though there have been many successive projects in these neighborhoods, that it has very often been based on or relied on a few individuals. So from this perspective, it has sometimes been difficult to ensure a transition and really to keep the knowledge that has been gathered during previous projects. And then looking at the last slide, or the next slide, please. Just briefly, I would like to sort of highlight some of the findings from the case study of Pori, but also looking at the other area-based initiatives that we have looked at in the project and tying these to a broader Nordic and perhaps Western European context. You could say that very often these types of area-based regeneration projects, they focus on similar types of areas, post-war neighborhoods, and also that they deal with similar problems or challenges. So they are various or a vast number of projects related to the built environment and housing stock, but also the socio-economic composition of the neighborhoods, for example. And also the notion that several objectives are pursued in parallel. So even though we're talking about area-based regeneration, they are by no means purely area-based or place-based, but they also focus a lot on the people-based aspect. And we see here, just to recap, as I mentioned, that these types of approaches seem more effective when dealing with local problems, but there are more challenges where we're talking about broader structural challenges where the causes might be located outside of the neighborhood. But thank you. I will then let Sandra take the floor so we can move to the next slide and she will continue from here.
Thank you very much, Mats. I will slightly shift the focus here and the topic, but focus on Sweden and the project we did about the establishment of housing for newly arrived refugees and the type of critical local reactions that occurred in some of the cases. So if we look a little bit to the background, between the mid-1980s until 2011, Sweden had between 10 to 40,000 asylum seekers yearly. But this has increased from 2012, as we could also see in Tim's presentation, with numbers reaching 163,000 for 2015. So with this challenges then that this generated in Sweden, there was also a situation already with a very uneven distribution of newly arrived refugees within the country, with some municipalities taking on a lot of responsibility and some municipalities not receiving people from this group. So in 2016, there was a new law in Sweden that made it compulsory for all municipalities to receive newly arrived refugees and then to be part of supporting them in their integration process. Adding to this, there was a housing shortage that we still see, but in the years of 2016, 2017, when a lot of these people were supposed to establish somewhere and have a residence in Sweden, then many municipalities reported that they had difficulties in finding housing for specifically this group. So there were local reactions to this in Sweden. Some were very positive. We remember the refugee welcome movements, but many also reacted negatively to that housing for this group of people would be established close to where they lived or in places that they found valuable for other reasons and so on. We can go to the next slide, please. So, to investigate this a bit further and get a picture from all over Sweden, we asked ourselves to which degree have Swedish municipalities witnessed local resistance against refugee housing, and what form does it take? And we sent out a survey to all the Swedish municipalities, and 60 municipalities replied. So this is about 20%. You can see them in the map here to the side. And the questions covered the years of 2012 to 2018, and the survey was targeting planning and building units in the municipalities. Next, please. We go directly to some of the findings. 50% of these 60 municipalities that replied, they had experienced protests in some sense to housing for the newly arrived refugees. And what we saw was that unconventional solutions were more likely to receive opposition, which we have also heard from other sources, and which was also quite clear from the media picture. So the type of housing that municipalities was offering due to lack of housing was, for example, to use hotels or rebuild venues that were supposed to be for other purposes than dwellings, and also using modules on temporary building permits, for example. And we also see that the reactions differ a bit from the other types of built environment, planning for built environment. It's very common in Sweden to have opposition against projects about the built environment. It's actually part of a formal planning process to be able to express your opinions. But we see that based on the replies here and what the municipalities experienced, the character in these cases was a bit different. So, for example, we see that concern, worry about the future. There were many. There were also people outside of the area in question that engaged in this opposition. A quarter of the municipalities said that they experienced racist arguments, and also that reactions could be more aggressive. And also we see that there were a few municipalities that report that they had people in favor of the housing that also engaged as a reaction to the reaction, so to say. We can take the next slide, please. So if we should say something about successes here, or success factors, there were, of course, many, the picture is very divided among the municipalities that participated. Some had problems with this and some didn't. And some of the municipalities that didn't experience protests, they wanted to highlight that they were working to integrate housing for newly arrived refugees in the other housing stock. So it's not becoming that of a visible part as with the modules and so on. But that can, of course, depend on what possibilities you have in the municipality, if you have vacant housing in the public rental housing stock, for example, or not. And then we also saw in a few cases that the opposition actually contributed to changing the location. So if there was first one location in one specific place in a municipality that was planned to use for housing for this group, the opposition could contribute to change the localization. And this could be both with positive and negative outcomes for the quality of the housing. We can take the next slide, please. So to conclude here, we saw that unconventional housing solutions caused more opposition The study points to the role of the receiving society, so that integration is not only about integrating newly arrived refugees, in this case themselves, but also to see how does the receiving community act, and what possibilities do we have to work with this as well. And the planning process itself then could be seen as a kind of arena to open up for this kind of dialogue with the receiving society as well. Yeah, I think I will stop there to not run over our time.
Thank you so much, Sandra. So let's have a Menti question.
Yes, quickly before there are any questions, please answer the next Menti question. It is a personal one this time. We want to know how well you have integrated your work lives into your private lives. So how many foreign-born friends do you have? None, a few, or a lot? And before we get to the results, Åsa has a question for Mats and Sandra.
Yes, so Mats or Sandra, you mentioned here, or Sandra, I should speak to you first. You mentioned that a conclusion from your study is also that, I mean, that reactions, but also how we work in the recipient community is very crucial to smooth integration, and that's pretty obvious, and of course relates to our Menti question as well. But if you look at it the other way around, do you see that there is actually some kind of demand for segregation, or put it differently, do we actually self-segregate? Do you see patterns of that as well when you look at these different policies and the strategies to try and create more integration? Is it hard because people actually tend to self-segregate? What's your comment to that?
Thank you, Åsa. It wasn't a particular thing we studied, but I can reflect on the question anyways. And I would say that the economic opportunities is probably one of the main things that decide on whether people can choose where to live or not, or like what kind of alternatives do they have. So I think that is one important part to answer this question. And then, of course, we see also segregation within the school environment. And here in Sweden, we have the free school choice, which makes parents able to kind of pick school for their children. And then we also see that more affluent families put their children in specific schools. So this, of course, creates also a picture of segregation. So I think there's a lot more to do here to kind of how do we bridge and make people meet and make people maybe not fear each other but gain from the diversity we have in the society.
Thank you, Sandra, and hopefully we're going to hear more about this also in our Nordic tour after our break when we're going to visit Iceland and Norway, for example. Thank you. What about the Menti results?
Yes, could we see the Menti results? I'm excited. This is nice to see. It seems that a lot of the people in our audience have foreign-born friends, so that's nice to see. Maybe we live in a bubble. I don't know, but anyway, it's a promising result.
Very promising indeed. And thanks again for responding to our Menti questions, and also thanks for asking so many questions in the chat. So before we continue with or go to the Q&A session, we want to hear from our final keynote speaker, and his name is Klaus Bech Danielsen. My Danish isn't perfect, as you can tell, but anyway, Klaus is a professor in architecture and spatial planning at Aalborg University, and you're actually principal investigator as well of an ongoing evaluation of the reconstruction of certain Danish so-called ghettos. And this is, of course, a quite specifically in a Swedish context, provocative policy, but not so much in Denmark, perhaps. So tell us more about the impacts of the Danish ghetto policy so far and what you've learned in your evaluation. Very welcome, Klaus.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to talk on this seminar. As said already, I'm a professor in architecture at Aalborg University, And I think I'll just go right on to my first slide, if you would put that on, please. Because I will give a little talk on refurbishment. The next slide, please. And transformation in Danish social housing areas. First, a quick tour through 35 years of refurbishments and transformation in these housing areas. And secondly, a discussion on the rather radical changes that are planned to take place in the most disadvantaged, 15 of the most disadvantaged areas in Denmark for the next 10 years. Firstly, on the next slide, a little insight to my work. I have studied refurbishment in social housing areas for 25 years now. Here on the slide, you can see some of my books and my reports on the topic, mainly on Danish social housing, but also sometimes having an international perspective on it. For instance, on the one at the right side, from ghetto to a mixed city, it's called. And the next slide. Currently, and for the next 10 years actually, I'll be working on an evaluation that will continuously evaluate, follow, and discuss the transformation initiated by the so-called Parallel Society Act in Denmark. The Parallel Society Act was passed in 2018 by the Danish Parliament, and it requires extensive and radical demolishing and transformation in 15 disadvantaged housing areas in Denmark. I'll come back to that. But now first a little tour de force. I can say this is some of the evaluations we are doing in this evaluation. We do the exact same evaluation every second years now for the next 10 years. For instance, following the way they are represented in the media, that's the circle diagram. Also evaluating on socioeconomics, and also see how are these areas actually used and by whom. Here on the map on the right side, you can see the housing area, social housing area. The yellow dots are people living inside the housing area, and the red dots are people coming from neighboring housing areas or from the neighboring city. And this is actually one of the targets in these areas, to invite more people from the outside into the areas. In Denmark, we have renewed and renovated post-war social housing developments over a period of 35 years now. And these have been shifting, there have been shifting strategies in what could be called 3 generations of refurbishments. If we take the next slide, the first generation started already back in the mid-80s. In some areas, just 10 years after the construction was finished, actually. The main focus was constructional problems in the buildings, mainly like cracking concrete on the facades or leaky roofs. However, since opinion about the mass-produced architecture from this period was strongly critical at that time, the technical solutions were often associated with the desire to change the architectural expression of the post-war buildings. A strategy was developed to conceal the original facades behind colorful facade coverings. You could say that the cosmetic changes was developed while the basic physical structures remained untouched. The refurbishments were combined with social programs, and research evaluations from back then concluded that the physical and the social programs together managed to stop further decline in the areas, but in basic they did not succeed to improve the social life and the social balance in the housing areas. So the next slide. The first generation of refurbishments were not long-lasting at all, and it was a lesson learned, an important lesson learned, that saving money by using poor and cheap materials is very expensive in the long run. Consequently, in refurbishments in the early 2000s, facades were covered by better materials now, for instance, traditional brickwork. However, the critical attitude towards the original architecture of the post-war period remained the same. It was simply erased in the refurbishments. In this second generation, a holistic approach was also developed. Constructional renewal on facades and rooftops were now combined with renewal of dwellings and in the outdoor landscapes. You can see here on the picture, on the slide, that these improvements in the outdoor landscapes actually was what really improved some of the areas very much, and with the impression and the experience of the scale suddenly became something else. However, evaluation subsequently concluded, and this evaluation was on the social and the physical transformations, concluded that the refurbishments and the social programs again failed to improve the social condition and the social balance basically in the areas. Therefore, it's largely the same 20 to 30 housing areas in Denmark that have continued to be socially disadvantaged over the last 30 years. This does not mean that the social programs have not helped a number of residents back on track, out of crime perhaps, or into a job. However, when this happens, the residents often move out of the area. This is what is described as the elevator effect. People from low-income groups are moving into the area, then they might get on track and on foot, and when this happens and when they're getting a job and when their income is higher, they will move out perhaps to private housing. Thus, the social status of the individuals might improve, while the social status of the housing area remains the same. The next slide. In the recent years, a third generation of refurbishments has developed in Denmark. In these refurbishments, the original post-war architecture is not rejected. It's assessed that the architecture actually does contain qualities, and sometimes it's considered an important part even of the cultural heritage of the Danish social welfare society. Therefore, the refurbishments are not targeting at erasing the post-war architectural footprints. They are preserving them, but at the same time adjusting them according to contemporary housing ideals by adding new qualities, new details, new functions, and perhaps better daylight in the dwellings. Next slide, please. This third generation of refurbishment also differs from the first two by operating on another level, on an urban scale, that is. Thus, the refurbishments are not anymore developed solely within the boundaries of the housing area itself. Now the housing area are considered in an urban context and in a relation to the surrounding city. In this perspective, the housing areas are perceived very often as isolated islands in the urban fabric. Next slide. This is exactly how they were planned back in the 60s and 70s, that means as isolated islands. To create safe and calm housing areas, no outside traffic was allowed to enter the site. The infrastructure takes a circle around the areas very often, and noise protections, together with fences, rows of trees, massive building blocks, and large parking areas create huge barriers towards the neighboring areas. Also, neighbors resident have no errands inside these areas. They simply don't come there. The social housing areas are therefore like huge gated communities. And what is gated here is actually disadvantaged inhabitants. Next slide. Here, some of the tools used in these years to break down these barriers. Basically, they are about creating a social mix inside the areas. Some of them aiming to have residents from the rest of the city entering the housing areas, and some of them aiming to have social mix among the residents living inside the housing area, creating mixed income housing, for instance. Next slide. The physical isolation in these isolated enclaves might contribute to social isolation. And with the words of Danish politicians, physical structures contribute to the development of parallel societies. And well, this is the main idea, this Parallel Society Act, and it states that we should have no ghettos in Denmark by 2030. So you might ask, what is a ghetto in this context? And it has to do with ownership, social housing, it has to be, and it has to do with scale. There should be at least 1,000 residents inside the housing area. And then we have these 5 criteria dealing with ethnic background, employment of the residents, crime rate, education rate, and income of the inhabitants. And on the next slide, you can see some more precise data on these criteria. I will not go so much into this, just saying that it's important to understand in a Danish context that the first one, the top one, ethnic background, the share of inhabitants having a non-Western background, that is the topic number 1. If you have this one and then 2 of the rest of the criteria, then the housing area is a ghetto. So this means that if you have 3 or 4 of the 4 criteria below, then it's not a ghetto. It has to do with ethnic background and then at least 2 of the rest of the criteria. So in Denmark, that's how it is. The ethnic situation is very important in these areas from a political point of view, at least. Next slide. Now, the next definition is not just a ghetto, but an even tougher word. We're also dealing with what in Danish is called hårde ghettoer. I translated it into tough ghettos. If a social area has been defined a ghetto 4 years in a row, then it will be defined as a tough ghetto. And in Denmark, this year we have 15 housing areas defined as tough ghettos. And I have mapped them here on the right side map. Also, just to show, these are represented in the same scale. So you see, even though these areas are always represented in the media as ghettos, like if one ghetto is just like the other ghettos, they are described as concrete blocks lying parallel next to each other and so on. The life there is the same always. But just look at how for instance, how the scale is totally different in these areas. Vollsmose, for instance, on the top right corner, is more than 30 times bigger than Mjølnerparken. And the whole urban context, the regional context, some of them are in the middle of Copenhagen, some of them are in the outskirts of Denmark. So of course also to innovate and to make urban development in these areas, the situation makes a huge difference to these areas. But transformation and refurbishment must be done by law. In these 15 areas, the Parallel Society Act demands that the share of social housing units must be cut down to 40% of what it is today during the next 10 years. So really tough, a tough law with this one. Next slide, please. And the law also set up some tools to manage to get down to these 40%. You can do it in 2 ways. You can either reduce the amount of social housing by demolishing. This means that you have to demolish 60% of the housing blocks. Or you can densify by adding 60%, for instance, private-owned houses. This can be done in Copenhagen, perhaps in Aarhus, growing cities. It is much harder if you go to Esbjerg or Korsør or some of the other smaller cities in Denmark. Next slide. Yeah, just to give some example of what's done in different housing areas. Of these 15 housing areas, this is in Taastrupgaard in the western part of Copenhagen. You can see the red blocks in the middle. 8 blocks will be demolished to give place to, and there will be built as a new school and a social institution there. Of course, to invite neighboring neighborhoods to come into the area, but also simply to cut down the scale when this other kind of building and this new life will enter the middle of the area. You can see on the plan that actually Taastrupgaard will be cut in 2, and thus the scale will simply be reduced by doing this. This is one of the ideas, at least. The next step, the next slide. This is Mjølnerparken, situated in the very center of Copenhagen. It looks like the same strategy, also operating in the middle of those 4 blocks. However, those blocks will not be demolished. They will be sold to private investigators. So this is another way to do the mixed income housing. There will be much more expensive, those in the middle, and still social housing in the 2 side blocks. The next one. And this is another Copenhagen estate called Tingbjerg, actually quite famous, built by Sten Eiler Rasmussen, a very famous Danish architect, and the landscaping is by C.T.H. Sørensen. Some of you might know him, showing that when you are in Copenhagen, you can also do this by densifying, not by demolishing so much, but by densifying here, building new small-scale row housing for middle-income families inside the courtyards of Tingbjerg to, densifying simply the area. And this is going to happen. The sites have been sold, and a huge private investor are going to build the first test houses here in the beginning of 2001. Next one. Yeah. In my title, I was asked to say, will there be any lasting effects of this? And to answer this question, I think it's very important that you first ask yourself whether you're focusing on the social life and status of the individuals living there already, or whether you are focusing on the social balance in the whole neighborhood, or whether you're focusing on the physical structures and the perception of the neighborhood. To answer the last question first, to take the next one. Next slide, please. Here, this is a huge social housing area, one of these 15 areas called Gellerupparken in Aarhus. And here you could see what it was like in 2007, what it was like last year. They already started to demolishing some blocks and to build up some new municipality office building in the middle, a big blue one, for instance, and some other buildings, and also private housing this year have been built already. And you see what it will be like in 10 years' time in 2030 if the plans will be followed. And it seems like the private investors are actually coming into the area and likes to build there. And of course, you can see that talking about the physical structure and the whole experience of this city, it will be almost impossible to experience what Gellerupparken used to be from a physical point of view. Next one. Talking about social effects on an urban level in this neighborhood. Yes, it will change. I'm sure that the socioeconomic data will be totally different in 10 years' time when these private housing have been built. They are attracting middle-class people, students, and other quite resourceful people. So it will change the whole situation in the area. However, and then the next slide, the question, and the real question is, what will happen to the individuals, the inhabitants living there already today? And this is what we are going to follow for the next 10 years. We will do a lot of also quantitative data together with an institute called VIVE in Denmark. And what is really interesting is that in principle, 40% of the inhabitants will stay in the area. 60% will have to move out. And which of these two groups will actually do best during the next 10 years? That's what we're going. I can tell you perhaps in 5 or 8 or 10 years, but right now we're just looking at this, having the next slide, as a huge housing experiment, social experiment going on in Danish society in these years. And we really are interested, as researchers, we are curious to see what this will bring us, what kind of results this will bring us. Thank you very much.
Klaus, for this really in-depth journey through the process of reconstructing the Danish communities, which are today or have been quite segregated over the years. We have a Menti question to follow up.
Yes, based on this presentation, we would also like to hear what our audience thinks. So please answer these statements and how you feel about them. The Danish ghetto policies are controversial, and the demolition of certain types of housing can contribute to better integration. And here you can choose on a scale 1 to 5 whether you disagree or agree. And before we get the results, also has a question.
Yes, a quick follow-up question to you, Klaus. And you entered into that discussion in the end, which I think many of us believe is quite intriguing. What will happen to the people in these areas and, of course, in the surrounding areas? Will it become a better social mix? So my question is, do you know what's happened so far with the people who were forced to move out of the houses or buildings that have already been demolished? Have they been forced to move other places in the same city, and has that created a better social mix in other areas in the city, or what's happening?
Well, we haven't followed it that close because we're just in the beginning of this process. But of course, it's also very different from municipality to municipality. Some of them are actually very dealing with the rehousing very professionally, and some of them are just saying this is up to the social housing units and social housing associations to find out where to rehouse people. So it will be very different from place to place, really. And also what we hear a lot about is that, not surprisingly perhaps, but housing areas in these municipalities, well-functioning housing areas, people are a bit scared or challenged that they will now have new neighbors. So that we're kind of afraid that some of these people will have neighbors looking not welcoming them very much because they know where they come from simply.
So new challenges for inclusion there to start on and to create these meeting places and make
Definitely.
people less scared. Super interesting. All right. How do we look at when we look at the results here, Pipsa? What do you see?
Yes. Can we have the Menti results? Okay. Interesting. The Danish ghetto policies are controversial to over half of our audience. They strongly agree, which I think is actually maybe a bit surprising. I would actually assume that number would be even higher. It's often lifted in the Nordic media as well, and it seems to raise opinions. It's very discussed topic. The other question, the demolition of certain types of housing can contribute to better integration. There we seem to be also more on the strongly agree side, but it seems to divide our audience quite a bit. So there we have the Menti results from our audience and how they feel about Klaus's topics.
And of course, I think to most of us, the whole idea of actually demolishing functioning buildings is rather radical. But on the other hand, it might be worth trying. And of course, it will be super interesting to follow the developments in Denmark and see where this ends up. And we'll also hear very soon from the rest of the keynotes and have their comments on this. All right, so now let's get started with our Q&A session. And we have all our 4 keynote speakers here, which is wonderful. So Pipsa, what do you find in our chat?
Yeah, I'm happy to see that we have some questions in the chat, and maybe we should start with the one that's for Klaus. Klaus, could you reflect on the concept of ghetto? Many avoid using the concept and consider it controversial and labeling. Do you see the usage of the term helpful or breaking segregation?
I find the notion of ghettos used by politicians as stigmatizing in itself, really. I don't like to use it myself, but it is in the law in Denmark. Therefore, when you discuss these things, you can't really get around the word. I would like to say disadvantaged housing areas and so on, but when we come to these definition of which housing areas has to deal with, get down to these 40%, then it is the housing area, the disadvantaged housing areas that has by law been defined as ghettos and even tough ghettos. And when we talk to the residents and the inhabitants living there, they hate the word, and they actually like the idea. Some of them, many of them, like the idea of creating social mix. It's mainly the rhetorics, the way they've been talked to, the way they are decided that kind of provokes.
Thank you, Klaus. What else do we have here,
Yeah,
Pirsa?
we have several questions for Mats and Sandra. Perhaps I'll start with Sandra. A little bit more specific on your case. How much dialogue did municipalities have with opposing actors when making planning decisions about the new housing areas? Is that a question that you could answer?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't really answer that in detail. It wasn't really, we couldn't really reach that type of questions via this survey. The survey format is somewhat limited and should, of course, be, I hope for other opportunities to follow this up with more in-depth study to focus more on the dialogue aspect. But we see also from previously that dialogue can, of course, kind of improve the situation, but it can also create tension. So it might not be any one answer about how to do that.
You also used the term unconventional housing solutions. Could you elaborate a little bit what you meant by that? Yeah,
sure. I think the most easy way to, in the best case scenario, it would be possible for the municipalities to arrange housing within the public rental stock that is part of the municipal mandate. But since there are limits in the vacancies due to housing shortage and so on, that can be difficult. And then the municipalities also look for other ways to arrange housing. It can be in the private rental housing stock, but also in some cases in Sweden, municipalities has purchased apartments, for example, which has been seen as controversial, as if there are a lot of public resources put towards this group. And then also renovation of other type of social services like buildings for daycare or for elderly homes and so on has also caused reactions sometimes. And then maybe more controversial in some places has been modules, which are then these type of modules that you can see in construction sites, for example, even though they are not designed in that way when they're used for housing. But when you actually put up new constructions to create housing for this group, then it kind of can create clashes because they are the places where they will be put up are maybe used for recreation or used as a green area and so on. So that can be controversial in some occasions.
Thank you, Sandra. And since we already touched upon the topic of dialogue in the municipalities, we also have a follow-up question for Mats. What do you mean by social participation in the case of Pori? And what example of increased participation due to residents becoming accustomed to these types of projects did you discover?
No, this was just a general observation, not by any means the key finding of this case study, but this point that I was emphasizing just referred to the notion that something that was emphasized was that the fact that many of these neighborhoods have been addressed by these successive regeneration projects is something that has led to the local inhabitants feeling that the neighborhoods are in the spotlight and that the neighborhoods are being looked after in that sense. And sort of the notion that when these successive regeneration projects have been ongoing in these neighborhoods, that over time the residents have become more included through, of course, formal participation, but also perhaps the residents being more knowledgeable and aware of what these projects are doing, and perhaps also about the limitations of these projects and not having unrealistic expectations, I would say.
I think that's really interesting, though. I mean, I guess you could flip that question around and also think of the more projects, the more project fatigue among the residents, right? Did you see any risk of that, or could you really see that, okay, people are they keep being engaged in these projects?
But I think this goes back to the one of the main points is that I think that to some extent there might be a risk of that, because of course, as we were talking about, like many of the broader structural problems, like long-term unemployment in the neighborhoods has not been addressed, which of course is a clear shortcoming. But then on the other hand, perhaps also, as Klaus was talking about, the physical effects of the refurbishment, not demolition in this case, but refurbishment is more tangible, and there it's easier to note that these projects do have some effect. But I think here perhaps going back to the point that to seeing the limitations of these projects and knowing what can be achieved locally and what are more broader structural causes that need to be addressed through other forms of policy, social policy, educational policy, and so forth.
I was actually, just before Pipsa continues with questions from you in the audience, just really wanted to hear from all of you. Like, have you seen any examples of these, I mean, more holistic or truly holistic citywide approaches where it's not only focusing on these sort of vulnerable areas, but really where the aim is to create bridges and make sure the area is part of the development of the entire municipality or city? Yeah, starting with Klaus, perhaps.
Well, I'm sitting in the advisory board in a municipality called Roskilde Kommune, and they do have a politics on mixed housing, not just in the disadvantaged housing areas in Roskilde Kommune, but every time they're developing a new area in Roskilde and redeveloping and so on, they will ask themselves, how can we provide a social mix in this area, and how can we go further this way? So this is an example of a Danish municipality that actually, in a broad, the politicians from all the parties are taking part in this in this advisory board and decided to go this way.
Yeah. So Roskilde is an interesting example. Mats, would you mention a municipality in Finland that you see is on a similar path or has a similar ambition?
Well, perhaps it could be worth mentioning the city of Helsinki, who has adopted a policy of social mixing, where different forms of tenure are mixed, where the ambition is. And this is a policy that has been ongoing since the 1960s, where the intention has been to avoid constructing neighborhoods that entirely are composed of social rented housing. So of course, this is a citywide policy that is adopted. And for example, comparing to Stockholm, there are not neighborhoods on the same scale where social housing or the neighborhoods are more mixed, and we can of course argue that this has not entirely stopped segregation. And for example, segregation in Helsinki has increased gradually over time, but I think that there is clear evidence that this policy has at least contributed to slowing down the segregation process. But of course, we cannot control where people choose to live. So I think it's also a limitation of policy making. We cannot. It's a challenging task.
Yeah. Tim or Sandra, what would you? Tim, for example, I know you've also obviously studied the developments in the U.S. a lot. What would you say? Is there a U.S. example that we should look to as well, or did you see any Nordic examples from your recent research where you think this is happening?
Yeah, I guess I've studied the U.S. less than the Nordic and other countries, but I do know that there are programs in the United States that somewhat maybe similar to what Mats was talking about in Finland, where in some cases they're looking at there's a difference between when they look at people and when they look at places. I mean, are you trying to look at a problem like, say, in Baltimore of areas, and a lot of Baltimore. I mean, we in the United States don't just have immigrants. We, of course, have the African-American population, so kind of a built-in underclass. But there's been programs, I know, in Baltimore of not addressing problem areas, but people living in those areas, and actually there's been some experiments of trying to move those people out of some of those areas, and instead of just dealing with the place, deal with the people. And some of those have been successful, some less successful.
I have a question from the chat for Tim, and it's a wide one, but I would really appreciate, Tim, if you could keep it short. What are the contributing factors of spatial spread of the migrants to peripheral municipalities? Are they labor market related, or migration policies in the host countries, or perhaps both? And how do these policies differ from country to country in the Nordics? That's a wide one.
I'll try and make it short. Yeah, I mean, there was certainly in 2015, 2016, there was different policies regarding the placement of people coming in as refugees or asylum seekers. I mean, some of the countries, Sweden kind of let people go wherever they want, whereas some of the other countries like Norway tried to place people in certain municipalities. I guess the other part of your question was the spatial effects. Yeah, again, that kind of differed by country. I mean, some of these places, they, people would go and settle in these remote areas. One of the trends, of course, we've been seeing, and we don't have data for all the countries, but one of the trends we're seeing is people are placed in some of these remote regions, and then 5-8 years later end up in the big cities. So you kind of exacerbate some of the same problems.
Thank you, Tim.
Do we have more questions? Any more questions for Sandra, for example?
We have a couple more questions. This maybe relates to a little bit what I asked from Tim already. Sandra, how would you reflect upon the different Nordic strategies of housing asylum seekers compared to your findings in Sweden? Could you?
What we know concerning this situation with local opposition or protest, as we call it in the study, we understood that it has been less common, or at least less brought less attention, both in Denmark and in Norway than in Sweden. And I can't say exactly what that like the reason for that, but I think part of what's important to understand in Sweden is this the housing shortage that had created this situation where, as the previous question, where this type of unconventional housing was needed to be found, because you couldn't just find vacant housing just waiting for these people back in 2016 and 2017 when this large amount of people were actually going to settle somewhere. Maybe I'm losing a little bit track of the question now, but if I relate also back to the previous questions, I would also like to make this relation between the settlement policy of newly arrived refugees and the local area-based strategies that we're also talking about here in this seminar, because we see that one way to kind of avoid that the so-called ghettos in Denmark, and now some specific areas in Sweden as well, that have a high share of newly arrived immigrants or more social challenges, for example. Now you can't, if you settle there as a newly arrived refugee, then you will lose your social subsidies. So that is kind of a way also looking at a more holistic perspective to actually work with other means than just the local area base to kind of steer at least who's settling here.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra, for mentioning that. That was actually one of my final questions to you as well. To what extent the way we welcome newcomers, so to speak, the most recent refugees, how much of a role that can play for the social mix. And I think that's pretty clear, as you said, Sandra, that also plays a role. Then, as Tim referred to, there is a strong pattern of urbanization, so to speak, that migrants tend to want to move to the stronger employment areas, or where the labor markets are stronger. So they might end up in the bigger cities anyways, but it's still also a lot of examples of smaller towns that actually manage to attract and keep migrants in the workforce. Anyway, we're coming very close to our break. Thank you so much, dear keynote speakers, and thank you, dear audience, for asking so many interesting questions. Pipsa, a final Menti question.
We have a final Menti question for you, to our audience. Please just write with one word your thoughts on this first part of today's session. It can be a feeling or a thought or an idea or just whatever you think would describe would describe this first part, and we will go through the word cloud after a 5-minute break.
Yes, we take 5 minutes from now, and then join us again for our Nordic tour.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for now.
Thank you.
See you soon.